Robert was a visitor for like a 1-week intensive teaching gig when I was a graduate student at Columbia. And I had known his work, which I actually had read in college. One of my professors taught it to us. But it was a really striking week, and I remember, this is an anecdote I have told before, but I remember at the end, like, the last class, kind of the grad students are sitting around, and we're talking to Robert more casually after what we've been doing. I remember Robert made us memorize a poem for one thing, which was a very intense exercise, because we're like, memorization this is not Shakespeare, man. What are we doing here? Nowadays, with the internet, we're even further removed from that oral tradition. But anyway, so the grad students were asking Robert, like, well, what's one problem for you in poetry? You're a very accomplished poet, critic, scholar. And Robert said to our surprise, facility. We were like, well, what does that mean? We're not even sure how to process that. Like, well, I know that I can write a poem. I'm I've been doing this. I'm very good at it. And I have to be sure that the poems I write are important to me, not just, a poem I could write. Now, graduate students can be a little argumentative or challenging to their professor, so we thought this was an interesting assertion. We said, well, how do you mean, Robert, you could, write poems with this kind of ease or facility? He said, well, I mean, if I needed to, I could write a poem about this coffee cup on the table. And this was the era of like a chock full of nuts, takeout paper coffee cup from a New York, diner on the table. And then somebody said, well, go ahead, write that poem for us. And, without missing a beat, Robert started in with, well, I would talk about the typography, the Depression-era typography that's still on this cup. How a whole notion of immigrant street culture diners is implicit in this cup. How coffee is about colonialism and empire, and how it's been brought here to New York City after all these years, and we're still living in the matrix of this, and on and on and on. And a very tough audience, as I say, we were as graduate students, just basically erupted into like applause at this spontaneous poem, which Robert had already introduced as a poem he wasn't going to write, because it was not even of the kind of seriousness of purpose with which he really takes his art. I'll read a few pieces of various thoughts I have about Robert's work, and I start always with the poem that, as I say, Robert's been an influence on me. A long poem he wrote early in his career, a book-length poem called An Explanation of America, has always been something I'm interested in explaining myself as a poet. And in that he says, a country is the thing it wants to see. I want for you, this is Robert, I want for you to see the things I see and more. Colonial diners, Disney, films of concentration camps, the napalm child trotting through famous news film in her diaper, the tattered flaps of skin, deep throat, the rest. An insistence on including culture in its variance and its layered and laminated effect. And so his readers have come to see the world for over 40 years, and 20-some books in multiple genres, through Robert Pinsky's eyes and in his voice. Even non-readers of poetry, whether they know it or not, have had their understanding of poetry shaped by Robert, first through his looming presence in American letters as poet laureate. He's still the only person to have served in that office for 3 years, and as a cultural adventurer who has managed to plant poetry's banner on such far-flung peaks of the zeitgeist as the Colbert Report and The Simpsons. So I often say about Robert, he's the only poet who goes from Homer to Homer Simpson. Robert's new book, Proverbs of Limbo, continues his poetic investigation of what was once called the human condition in all its dialectical untidiness. His poems look in two directions at once, inward toward psychology, at the mysteries of love and sexuality, the family and its discontents, and outward toward history and culture, always human culture in its endless manifestations, music, language, belief systems, the texture of great cities, art in its endless ramifications, the Jewish tradition that informs his identity, the American experience that defines it. For Robert, to return to the theme of significance and import, as for Seamus Heaney or Czesław Miłosz, as for Robert Hass or Frank Bidart, writing a poem is a moral action. And the world being what it is, a bewildering miasma of suffering and enlightenment, what one elects to portray in one's art is not merely a matter of self-expression, but an ethical choice. So we're going to have a conversation, but we're going to start by letting Robert read to us from the new book or whatever he chooses to read, and then we'll converse about that. Robert loves being surprised or even perhaps ambushed, as by those graduate students I once was. So even as we are conversing, if people have questions, we can roll that right into our conversation. We don't have to wait for a designated period at the end, okay? Please welcome Robert Pinsky.
I would like to welcome conversation. And if there are questions, we don't have to do them at the end. We can do them while we're talking. And Campbell is a poet I admire immensely, and I will welcome conversation. I'm going to start by telling you some things that are on my mind, some things I've been writing lately, and I know that I'm here for this book, Proverbs of Limbo, and I will eventually read some poems from that to you. I have been working on a prose piece that I guess I'm going to sort of paraphrase for you now. This is going to be in the Atlantic online next week. Get posted, I hope, tomorrow or Tuesday. And I begin that piece by reflecting on how my friends and I keep returning for this moment after the election. We keep saying, are we in the position that progressive liberals were in Germany in January of 1943 when Adolf Hitler was appointed chancellor? And I say I want to suggest a different historical analogy that has a lot to do with my experience of poetry and the poets I have known. And I was fortunate to live in Berkeley at the same time as the great Polish poet Czesław Miłosz, and I became Czesław's friend, and along with Robert Hass, worked on English versions of Miłosz poems based on trots. Czesław's English was very good. He wrote trots for us. And a very, very fraught moment in his life was the historical period I'm going to suggest, which is Eastern Europe right after the war. Czesław Miłosz wrote a book called The Captive Mind that has been in print for about 80 years. It has sold, I guess, millions of copies. And it's a book that reflects the period of terrific uncertainty and confusion he experienced when there was a Stalinist government that installed the government in Poland. And Czesław was, briefly, he was a cultural attaché at the Polish embassy in Washington. And he had seen many of his friends tortured and murdered in concentration camps. He had a poem about the amusement park in which you could hear the people at the last moments of the ghetto rising. And now, was he going to serve this totalitarian government? The thesis of The Captive Mind is about writers, poets, novelists, intellectuals that he knew. And the thesis of his book is that imagination, literary ability, the the qualities of intellectuals, literary critics, writers. These do not necessarily protect you from becoming the intellectual servant or agent of a government. The thesis is, on the contrary, it makes you better at rationalizing, temporizing. If you have complicated historical insights and you're used to making very sophisticated points, you can temporize and rationalize and gradually, by very small degrees, make your mind captive. So Czesław was having this uncertainty in his writing, in his life, and I'll try to lighten this a bit with an anecdote. He had a drive from Washington, where he was a cultural attaché, to New York. And he decided on the way he'd stop and ask some advice from the smartest man in the world. So he stopped in Princeton, New Jersey, and he talked to Albert Einstein. And he said, Einstein, there's this terrible government that's controlling my country. I think at the time he was thinking of moving to Paris, though he wound up in Berkeley, California. And in a way, it's a story about all of us, our experience. Who was Einstein? Einstein had been forced to become an émigré. A horrible regime had expelled him. So, of course, Einstein said, oh, you must never lose your culture. Oh, never, if you can hold on to your culture, especially as a poet. And in fact, Czesław did not follow Einstein's advice. He wrote an essay, it's a famous essay, I think maybe entitled No, published in the Polish literary magazine in Paris, saying that I am choosing as a poet to leave my native language. I'm committing suicide as a poet. That turned out not to be true. And I'm now going to read to you a version I made in English of a poem that Czesław wrote in 1947 when he was going through all this. I like being a little mischievous and perverse. I say, I'm sort of hoping that some of you will be disappointed by this poem. Song on Porcelain. Rose-colored cup and saucer, flowery demi-tasses. You lie beside the river where an armored column passes. Winds from across the meadows sprinkle the banks with dew. A torn apple tree's shadow falls on the muddy path. The ground everywhere is strewn with bits of brittle froth. Of all things broken and lost, porcelain troubles me most. Before the first red tones begin to warm the sky, the earth wakes up and moans at the small, sad cry of cups and saucers cracking, the master's precious dream of roses, of mowers raking and shepherds on the lawn. The black underground stream swallows the frozen swan. This morning, as I walked past, the porcelain troubled me most. The blackened plain spreads out to where the horizon blurs in a litter of handle and spout, a lively pulp that stirs and crunches under my feet. Pretty, useless foam. Your stained colors are sweet, spattered in dirty waves, flecking the fresh black loam in the mounds of these new graves. In sorrow and pain and cost, sir, porcelain troubles me most. I wrote that English version somewhere around 1980, and I read it at a poetry reading I was giving at Cody's bookstore in Berkeley, and to my surprise, at the poem, somebody hissed. There was a visible, loud, audible hiss. Bay Area audiences are very expressive. They'll sometimes go, oh, that was good. Oh, yeah. They try to imitate a black church just a little bit. And I think I understand the hiss. It's why I made that little joke at your expense saying, I hope you'll be disappointed. I believe that the person who hissed in a literal kind of righteousness thought that Czesław should have written, of all things broken and lost, 6 million dead Jews troubles me most. Or the bombing of Dresden and Warsaw and Hiroshima bothers me most. Whereas the porcelain, which is exquisite, difficult to make, took a long time to import the technique from China, it's very different from mere crockery. It's translucent. And the images of pastoral fantasy, that's the old, beautiful European culture, the Europe that destroyed itself. It wasn't people from Africa or Australia who destroyed Europe. It was Europeans. And he's troubled for the same reason that made him write The Captive World. The porcelain is one of the pinnacle products of the beautiful culture of his language, and all of the death and destruction somehow was there potentially in that beautiful culture. And I think I chose to tell the story in this piece that's going to be in the Atlantic. The story of the hiss was important to me because I feel that I'm going to be part of cultural resistance in some small way, that a teacher and poet can be part of a resistance. But I don't want to make that drive me. I don't want, on one hand, to be mere temporizing and accommodation, and I don't want it, on the other hand, to be mere righteousness, to merely enjoy my righteousness. That seems to be the next project, and that's why possibly Stalinism and the post-war period applies better. To give you an example of the kind of thing that's in Czesław World, in Captive Mind, let's say you're an English professor and an official says to you, we are not going to interfere. This decision you're going to make about who you promote and the decision about who gets that prize, let me assure you that we're not allowed to consider that at all when we are weighing your application for a new apartment, a larger apartment. And it won't affect, I know your child needs this expensive therapy, it won't affect our decision about that at all. Meaning, it might affect our decision. So, currently, we're asking ourselves how politicians and others who sort of almost offhandedly said, I'm fed up now with this person, or never, never, somehow, because they are experts at certain kinds of thinking and certain kind of language, make the transition. In The Captive Mind, I guess I'm selling Czesław's book inadvertently when I'm supposed to be selling mine. In The Captive Mind, you see an intimate, deeply informed, personal observation of that process. And he uses pseudonyms, but these are basically famous writers that he knows. So I will now accept questions or kind remarks, and then I'll read some poems from my new book, Proverbs of Limbo, which incidentally I suspect may be my best book ever.
Ah, well,
I'm just mentioning that.
So I am reminded of when Czeslaw Miłosz came to read at the book fair. He was in a classroom with maybe 8 or 10 people in the room, and a kid asked him a question. Are you married? And he ruffled some papers and he says, I have been provoked. And he read a poem called Fire. And he said it was the first time he'd ever read it in public. That's why we love poets. That's why we love the book fair.
There was also the famous time he was here in the reading with multiple. Who else was there, Steve? There were going to be 5 Nobel laureates, but Heaney wasn't able to arrive. It was Octavio Paz, Miłosz, and Derek Walcott. That was a wonderful, wonderful Miami literary event.
He was very amused. He had a good laugh. And when he won the Nobel Prize, he found it very amusing. He had written a poem saying, I'll never wear a crown. And when he...
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Yeah. I'd like to finish my sentence first. There's a microphone for you there. Okay. While you're walking that way... Yeah, make it snappy, and I'll finish what I was saying. On the subject of small audiences, I remember a reading that Czesław gave with his then publisher, Dan Halpern, in Berkeley. 4 or 5 people attended. And within weeks, it was announced that Czesław Miłosz had won the Nobel Prize. And they had a reading, and people were outside listening on microphones. And I remember laughing with Czesław at the time. Your writing must have gotten much better in those few weeks. Sir.
Was that snappy enough? I'm just curious. You teach English, I assume. Is that right? Or yeah. Okay. When you watch television and listen to the news presenters and the other people speaking, how horrified are you by their English? I know I am, and I don't teach English. I just think they should study English. They say things like, where are you at? That's appallingly bad.
Yes. Well, Robert and I were discussing, it's not only newscasters whose English and grammar and sense of the language have deteriorated. English majors at colleges, you know. My God. So it's easy and perhaps rateful to bemoan the kind of decay of rhetoric, right? Rhetorical excellence. But we'll see what Robert will obviously have very wise things to say about it. But on one hand, it's
the historical precedent is we need to learn to hear when the new thing is being used well.
Okay.
And the early first rap music, the first rap, you could tell it was musically unimaginative, and it was unimaginative as English. And very quickly, even the first generation, Mos Def, then a man called Sadiq, it started getting better. And this thing of kids saying like every few words, some do it with a lot of wit and imagination and self-parody. Some do it other ways. Every period has always said language is decaying. It always means there needs to be a new understanding of language. Emily Dickinson had her grammar and her meter corrected because it seemed barbaric, and in a way it was, but she set a model for people like Campbell and me. So I'm cautiously and skeptically optimistic that what seems possibly like a decay in language is really the atrophy of something old. You know, when I knew Trump was going to win, I actually changed channels. I was, as a slavish liberal, I was watching MSNBC, and I was watching Ari Melber, and the working class hero Michael Moore was there. Yeah. And Michael Moore, giggling and chuckling, said to a giggling and chuckling Ari Melber, "What's your favorite album? What's your favorite album?" I changed the channel, and I said to my wife, Trump is going to win. Well, because those guys were stupidly indulging their superiority, and they thinking they knew what was good. And I recognized myself and my friends in it. They're finding it funny to ask, what's your favorite album? We're fucked now. We're in for something.
Well, it's not just English. I'm a psychotherapist. I get 20-year-old kids who just graduated from high school 2 years ago who do not know who Paul Revere was.
That may be right. Yes. Between the microphone that you're using and my hearing aids, I'm getting only a little of what you're saying, but I think I get the drift. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Well, this is... Well, they don't know who Bruce Springsteen is, too. So the point is, but this is a very interesting question.
It's Patricia's turn now.
Yeah. Thank you.
I love language, and I speak several languages. And when I was young, I was drilled in grammar and usage, so I cringe at some of the language I hear today. And then I have to remind myself that all things change and language evolves, and there's no way to stop that. I think that we have to, I'd like to hear what your thoughts on that.
Appreciate when it's done with genius. I mean, I cringe every time I hear somebody misuse the accusative and the nominative. When the, not just athletes, but politicians and journalists say, this was what happened to her and I, as though I is somehow more polite than me. And the grammarian in me bristles. And I just tell myself, somebody who does that is also going to write something great or say something eloquent. It's evolving. I feel the same way you do.
Hi, this is sort of a big picture question. Back when I was in high school, back in the 80s, it was said to me that what happened in Germany could happen here, and I thought to myself, no chance. Obviously, there's a political situation that's taken place here, and there's conversations of putting military in the street. It's been said that people that'll burn books will burn people, and certainly book banning has just taken off the charts. And on the spectrum, that's well on its way to something like that. What's your take on sort of what's going on with that?
Help me out.
Banning books.
I mean, it's what you were touching on already in talking about, are we in a 1933 moment or in a post-war moment? What sort of oppression is implied by whatever is in mind of the incoming regime? And we don't know yet, but people who burn books will also burn people. It's an interesting statement.
In the book in the book-length poem An Explanation of America, that young Campbell pleased me by liking that second or third book of mine. A main subject is American provincialism, American nativism, particularly in rural back reaches of America, xenophobia. And I am not an expert on what the political manifestations might be of xenophobia, provincialism, all of that dread born of early settlers and maybe to do with religious anxieties, but we can identify them by reading history.
And reading literature, too. Because, I mean, one of the few things that I try to cling to as a heartening thought is that there's not really a character out there in the Trump world that, like, Mark Twain wouldn't recognize and didn't write about. So, in that sense, maybe it's just another episode of a kind of nativistic...
If you read the chapter on the Duke and the Dauphin in Huckleberry Finn, it'll be absolutely recognizable description of contemporary politicians. You will have completely accurate. One more question, and then I'm going to do my thing of reading my poems.
I also want to recommend Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451.
Fahrenheit 451.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I have a question. Thank you for coming. There was a panel yesterday afternoon of female Jewish authors who talked in part about the virulent and abundant anti-Semitism that they've been experiencing, particularly through social media, but not just on social media, but at book readings and workshops and that sort of thing. I was wondering if you're having any experience or have any perspective on that in the poetry world of American literature.
Going back to young Czesław Miłosz in 1943 and 1947, the suicide of his culture had partly involved the deeply rooted binary distinction, Jew, not Jew. That was very simple. It was reductive. And it seemed subsumed and malleable and maybe dwindling. If you were an optimistic intellectual, the binary turned to be very powerful. It's enough in my own background that I'm aware of binaries now. Of color, not of color. It's a good distinction to make. It's real, but it is binary. Mm-hmm. And the reduction of people to binary or simplistic distinctions is part of what I mean by provincialism. And it's part of the beauty of poetry. It is bodily as well as intellectual. And the videos I made, favoritepoem.org, they show how a poem happens each time one particular person gives their voice to it. The art of poetry, by its medium, by its nature, respects the dignity of the individual. And that is my hope for the art of poetry, is that it has always, one way and another, respected the dignity of the individual voice as distinct from the mass and crude distinctions. I'll read the first poem in Proverbs of Limbo. It is called Poem of Names. Poem of Names. The bad rain fell on Osamu Shimomura. On the walk home from school, it turned his white shirt black. Quote, "My grandmother got me quickly into a bath. It likely saved me from death by radiation." End quote. Tuvalu's Ernst Berinsky would not discuss his family killed by Nazis. Quote, "An area I have liquidated for my mental health." End quote. Berinsky's grave at Tuvalu, a kind of shrine. Salma begat Boaz, and Boaz begat Obed, underground river of passion and retrenchment. Thank you, Elliot, Simon, and Hazel, for wanting to talk with me about my dying someday. Your dog Bucky had been so cold when you touched his body. A compliment for me, that conversation. It almost doesn't matter what we said. I thought of Milford, your great-grandpa. That time I asked him, did he believe in life after death? I guess that you are my life after death, he said. A boy named Christian at a Q&A in Texas asked me, the visiting poet, quote, "What motivates you? What gets you out of bed each day?" End quote. Good question. The pride of Ernst Berinsky of Mississippi. The shame of Nathan Forrest of Pillow Hill. Willie Lee Rose, historian of Reconstruction. Congressman Pellegrino Rodino, called Pete. It's the dead people that motivate me, Christian. Dorothy Pinsky Wright. William Butler Yeats. As to your name, I remember my friend Don Polk saying, quote, "A lot of Jewish people think they're white, but no, they're not," end quote. In some ways, Yeats was a jerk. Arphaxad begat Salah. Salah begat Eber. "Oh yeah?" said Ruby to Don. "Well, most black people don't know they're goyim," end quote. Somebody said about Rodino and Sirica, the night school guys are saving the country. Borinsky needed a job, but no white school could offer him a position. Tougaloo did. At his famous forums there, he asked his students to sit one chair apart so the white kids from Millsaps sat among them. Pete Seeger, Ralph Bunch, Joan Baez at the forums. Rodino in the House, impeaching Nixon. Pellegrino means pilgrim. Shimomura discovered cells that made a jellyfish glow. He garnered 1 million samples in Puget Sound. A protein in Iquaria victoria, embedded to glimmer in other life, transformed the study of living things. Years later, the Exxon Valdez oil spill left nearly all those Iquaria dead, a poisoning that Shimomura indicted, he whose grandma had washed away the ashes. I guess we have time for one more poem. You may have noticed I got the Underground River from, I had not realized that I'd quoted my own version of Czesław's poem. So that was the first poem in the book. I'll read why not? I'll read the second poem in the book. Branca. Ralph Branca was the 15th of 17 children. This poem is not the poem of the speaker. His father was an immigrant from Calabria. These words are those of Robert Pinsky speaking. Branca wore Dodger uniform number 13. Speaking is the punchline of a Jewish joke. Some Romans called Calabrians Africani. Brooklyn had its own daily, the Brooklyn Eagle. At 85, Branca learned about his mother. He was 21 when Robinson joined the Dodgers. At 11, I loved Robinson for his daring, running the bases, stealing home, his fire. Branca was one of the few who befriended him. I was too young to understand his mission, the fuel of that dancing to taunt the pitcher. Robinson never forgot Branca's kindness. What the old man found out about his mother is she was born a Jew in Hungary, Kati. After he gave up the most famous home run ever, back in the clubhouse, Ralph Branca lay weeping, face down. Kati gave birth to 17 Catholic children. The Giants won the pennant, 1951. Branca means claw, a fit name for a pitcher. His teammates thought it best he cry alone, but, quote, only my dear friend, Jackie, who knew me so well, came near and put his arm around my shoulder, end quote. The Nazis killed the aunts and uncles Branca didn't know existed till he was old. 42. 42 in itself a nothing of a number. The Dodgers traded Branca to the Tigers. Grief, with its countless different ways and strains. Glory, a greater thing than success, but slower. Some of the Tigers who had been Giants explained to Branca how the Giants had stolen the signs from opposition catchers, the telescope in center field, wires, buzzers. Branca chose not to talk about it. It's all in Prager's book. His research unearthed Kati, those aunts and uncles. The Dodgers were taken away from Brooklyn by their owner. I, Robert Pinsky, choose not to say his name. I didn't live in Brooklyn, but I knew the score. I knew it was a kind of underdog place. Nowadays, Once a year, all major leaguers wear Jackie Robinson's number, 42. Big deal. In the joke, the person who answers the telephone at Goldberg, Goldberg, and Goldberg keeps replying that Goldberg is out of the office, and so is Goldberg. All right, then, let me talk to Goldberg. Speaking. Robinson spoke to Bronca. Without you, he said, we never could have made it this far.
Well, you couldn't have chosen two poems to more encapsulate your poetics of human culture, human identity, that the very names we carry have an entire history of ethnicity and culture embedded in them. Robert's going to be signing books outside, and we thank you all.